Okay, so I'll introduce our first speaker, and I'll keep these introductions brief so we have enough time for discussion. Graham Harman is a professor of philosophy and the associate provost for research administration at the American University of Cairo. He calls his work an object-oriented philosophy, and this involves reading Heidegger's tool analysis as a metaphysics of autonomous objects. So this is something that really challenges traditional phenomenological approaches, which tend to be centered on human perception. And for this reason, I think Harman's work has attracted significant interest outside of philosophy itself, including fields like architecture, literature, geography, and of course, media theory. His books include, and he has many, Tool Being, Heidegger and Metaphysics and the Metaphysics of Objects, Prince of Networks, Bruno Latour and Metaphysics, and the Quadruple Object. And today Graham is going to be speaking on the topic of McLuhan and phenomenology. Graham, please. Thank you.
I'm going to need to read this very quickly to fit it into 20 minutes, but I tend to read quickly anyway. McLuhan and phenomenology is one of the most important themes I can think of for present-day philosophy, yet there are specific reasons why many people are not in a good position to see it now. Today I will speak about some of the obstacles to appreciating both McLuhan and phenomenology in the early 21st century, and will also suggest that it is urgent that we circumvent these obstacles so as to put philosophy on a new track. To do so, it will be necessary to begin with some remarks on the state of contemporary philosophy. Following this, I will turn to my main theme roughly halfway through, McLuhan and phenomenology. Our dominant contemporary philosopher is still Immanuel Kant, even though he's been dead for more than 200 years. What was most new in Kant, and what remains new even today, is the relation he emphasizes between depth and surface, the unknowable depth of the noumenal things in themselves and the accessible phenomenal surface of the things for us. One of the major ways of responding to Kant has been to treat this problem repeatedly as a pseudo-problem. The things in themselves are ridiculed even by many of Kant's admirers, though this ongoing ridicule betrays the fact that everyone knows they must account for reality in some way, under penalty of endorsing a full-blown idealism a la Berkeley, of a sort that seems so extravagant that almost no one is willing to defend it. If Berkeley represents pure idealism, and the things in themselves beyond human knowledge represent pure realism, the enterprise of much contemporary philosophy is to thread the needle in some way. The pony must be kept and also sold. We must go beyond the supposed pseudo-problem of realism and idealism. One common method of doing this is the correlationist method, so lucidly diagnosed in 2006 by Quentin Meillassoux, and whose diagnosis provoked the counter-movement of speculative realism in its four basic forms. Correlationism refers to the claim that we cannot think of the world without humans, or humans without the world, but only of the primordial correlation or rapport between them. In short, correlationism agrees with Kant that we cannot know the things in themselves, but remain trapped within the human world correlate, while also denying that it's a trap at all. For even to speak of something outside the correlate is impossible, since we ourselves are doing the speaking, and therefore the human standpoint retains priority, even though so-called humanism is treated with contempt. The argument is a familiar one, and for some reason, and for some, it remains quite compelling. To think of the things in themselves outside thought is supposedly a performative contradiction, since in doing so, we claim to be thinking of the unthought. This is what Meillassoux calls the correlationist circle. Now, Meillassoux remarks on ancestrality in the archifossil, in his book, of a reality pre-existing the emergence of thought by billions of years, are often misread as if they were meant as a scientific disproof of the human world correlate. But this is by no means the case. Meillassoux accepts the argument of the correlationist circle against all dogmatic access to the things themselves. Namely, we can't think the unthought without turning it into a thought. His appeal to ancestrality and the archifossil are simply meant to show that there is an inherent tension between correlationism and the claims of natural science. And for Meillassoux, this tension must be addressed not simply by asserting that science proves realism, but by doing justice to science from within the correlationist circle that Meillassoux himself accepts. Elsewhere, I have tried to show several reasons why Meillassoux' solution fails. He argues only that mathematics allows us to discover the primary of quality things that can exist, even if no human thought has yet emerged, and even if all human thought is someday exterminated. In other words, it is merely a temporal in itself that can outlast the human lifespan. But insofar as humans in the world both exist currently, there is no in itself beyond the access of thought for Meillassoux. We can know the world directly via the tools of mathematics and the Galilean natural sciences that mathematics makes possible. Whereas Meillassoux accepts the correlationist circle at the start and seeks a complicated argument to escape it, I hold that he never does escape it, since he ends up with a model in which the world is thoroughly penetrable in principle by mathematical tools. Given his inability to account for the fact that knowledge of the real is always a translation, and hence a distortion or transformation of the real, Meillassoux, like the correlationists he criticizes so severely, is in fact an idealist rather than a realist. Another attempt to sidestep the problem of reality can be found in recent philosophies of Hegelian inspiration, such as that of Slavoj Žižek, who is obviously well known here at Birkbeck. For Žižek, who draws on Lacanian psychoanalysis at least as much as Hegelian philosophy, the difference between subject and object is itself generated only by the subject in its difference from itself, in its encounter with the inassimilable traumatic real kernel at the heart of subjective experience. Žižek's philosophical position is every bit as sophisticated as Meillassoux', but it ultimately derives from the same acceptance of the correlationist circle, with its claim that to think of an in-itself outside thought is to fall into a performative or pragmatic contradiction. As Žižek and co-author Marcus Gabriel put it in their 2009 book, Mythology, Madness, and Laughter, German idealism was designed to effectuate a shift from epistemology to a new ontology without simply regressing to a pre-critical metaphysics. But this is a misunderstanding of how pre-critical or pre-Kantian metaphysics did its work. The problem with pre-critical dogmatic metaphysics was its insistence on the direct knowability of things in themselves, such that it offered rational proofs of the finitude or infinity of time and space, the existence or non-existence of God, a smallest particle of matter, or free will. Kant's answer to such dogmatic metaphysics was to insist on a gap between the inherent reality of such things and any access to them. For this reason, there is no performative contradiction at work when Kant holds that there are things in themselves that can be thought but not known, any more than it is a performative contradiction to refer to Prime Minister Cameron by name without being able to specify in exhaustive manner the exact features and motivations of his character. Kant's critique of dogmatism is a critique of the accessibility of the real, not of the existence of it. And the fact that in speaking of the real we are speaking of it does not entail that it cannot be real apart from our speaking. For this reason, it is Meillassoux and Žižek who are the true heirs of dogmatism. I leave out Marcus Gabriel, who has distanced himself somewhat from the claims made in the 2009 book, given their view that we can access the real directly. In fact, the only way to avoid dogmatism is to follow Kant in insisting on a gap between the real and any access to it. Kant's mistake lay not in endorsing finitude, but in making it a special tragic property of human beings, so that only rational beings were haunted by the inaccessibility of the end itself, when the same must hold true of animals, wheat, and colliding stones. In all of these cases, the real is not fully translatable into any relation to the real. This is the central principle of object-oriented philosophy, which might have been defended 2 centuries earlier if Kant had been abandoned in favor of a German realism rather than a German idealism. For further discussion of this point, I'll refer you to my books, since there's other topics now to cover. I'll make one other point about Meillassoux and Žižek, who are full-blown idealists, despite their denial of it, and despite Žižek's misunderstanding of Meillassoux as a sort of dangerous pre-critical realist. It is not accidental that both thinkers call themselves materialists, since materialism is simply idealism with an alibi, as Bruno Latour has nicely noted in a brilliant article that amazingly has only been cited 24 times in its 6 years of existence, despite Latour's international fame. And that's, can we get our materialism back, please, if you don't know that article. Latour's point in this article, which I endorse completely, is that materialism in no way exhausts the real, but simply reduces entities to some particular inadequate model of what they are, whether it be mass, spatio-temporal location, resistance, or in Meillassoux' case, mathematizability. By reducing the thing to its formalizability in material terms, material in scare quotes, we deny the inherent mystery and surprise of things and make them isomorphic with our knowledge of them under ideal intellectual conditions. So, materialism is always a kind of idealism, and that is why I have called for realism without materialism, or Kant without the human privilege, rather than Kant without the limitations on knowledge, which is what Meillassoux and Žižek recommend. Despite the great prestige of materialism on the political left as a tool for annihilating sorcerers, churches, witch doctors, capitalism, and tooth fairies, we must not forget that materialism is philosophically flawed. Rather than being the opposite to idealism, as the Marxist tradition still claims, materialism is perhaps the very incarnation of it. That brings us to McLuhan and Phenomenology, who perhaps surprisingly offer us a way out of idealism in both its materialist and non-materialist variants. My thesis concerning McLuhan and Phenomenology is simple. Namely, both can be described as media theory, but in a surprising twofold sense that reflects the ambivalence of media themselves. Namely, in a first sense, media are that which hide in the background behind any content, providing the invisible conditions for the visibility of that content. We find this idea everywhere in McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan, but most famously in his slogan that the medium is the message. But we also find this idea in Heidegger, the former crown prince of phenomenology, with his notion that being, or that which withdraws, is always more profound than the legible surface of presence at hand or the stockpiling work of technology. But in a second sense, media are not what withdraws behind all content, but that which enables the very transmission of content. While less conspicuous in McLuhan's work, this idea is no less pivotal for his thinking than the saying that the medium is the message. And this is the idea that we surprisingly find in the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology in 1900. To state this duality in terms of Kantian philosophy, in one sense media theory is about the noumenal background to any explicit content, while in another sense media theory is about the phenomenal space through which all hidden backgrounds communicate. Both senses of mediation are crucial for present-day philosophy, and both require that we abandon the idealism and materialism that dominate the scene at the moment. For this reason, to defend McLuhan is to ask for a new turn in philosophy. McLuhan's basic idea is stated and repeated clearly throughout his breakthrough book of 1964, Understanding Media. The medium is the message, which is to say that the content of any medium is always another medium. For example, the railway accelerated and enlarged the scale of previous human functions, creating totally new kinds of cities and new kinds of work and leisure. This happened whether the railway functioned in a tropical or northern environment and is quite independent of the freight or content of the railway medium. And likewise, whether the electric light is being used for brain surgery or night baseball is a matter of indifference, according to McLuhan. To say that the medium is the message is to say that the surface content of any medium is trivial compared with the changes wrought by the unnoticed background conditions of that medium. McLuhan expands on that point 10 pages later. Our conventional response to all media, namely that it is how they are used that counts, is the numb stance of the technological idiots. For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the minds. The effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts, but alter sense ratios or patterns of perception steadily and without any resistance. For anyone familiar with recent philosophy, there is an obvious parallel with Heidegger. Heidegger, too, is a theorist of the depths rather than the surface. Whereas phenomenology tries to suspend all judgment about the world outside conscious accessibility, Heidegger notes that conscious awareness is a relatively rare case. His question of being as opposed to the question of beings, which on the one hand has to do with unity over against plurality, but more importantly refers to the veiled or concealed character of being over against the manifest presence of beings. For both McLuhan and Heidegger, the deep background conditions of a situation are everything, and the surface content of perception is merely derivative. This might seem to lead to a passive attitude on the part of humans, in politics as elsewhere. Heidegger of the later period is often accused, understandably enough, of advocating that we merely wait for the next great epoch of being to send itself rather than engaging in overt political activity. Analogously, McLuhan is often accused of being a technological determinist who sees all deliberate human action as a frivolous playing with content silently dominated by the background media in play at any given moment. Both McLuhan and Heidegger seem to have such allegiance to the depths of the world that they excessively downplay the surface where human decisions unfold. Yet this is not entirely true. In Heidegger's case, for example, being needs human being as its shepherd, allowing it to come to presence in different historical forms. And more than this, for reasons I can't argue in detail this morning, since entities withdraw absolutely from each other, they can only make contact with surfaces or caricatures of each other. The same holds for McLuhan. Media in themselves for McLuhan are so deep that if they were truly beyond all earthly attempts to change them, each medium would remain permanently in force, and the very history of media that McLuhan describes would be impossible. There are actually two ways McLuhan thinks media can change. The first is through the role of artists in the widest sense, in what the later McLuhan calls retrieval. We humans are not helpless as long as there are artists in our midst, for as McLuhan puts it, the serious artist is the only person able to experience technology with impunity, just because the serious artist is an expert aware of the changes in sense perception. Whereas most of us, most of the time, are simply hypnotized by the background effects of technology, the serious artist for McLuhan is able to create an anti-environment that makes the medium itself visible and thereby counter its dangers. The artist can take dead cliches and bring them back to life as active media, which is precisely what retrieval means for McLuhan. If normally the medium is the message, the artist converts message into a new medium. In this way, the supposedly worthless sensual content of the world becomes the gateway to a change in the media themselves. And there's also a second way for McLuhan that the content leads to changes in the ground, one that does not rely on the intermittent genius of serious artists. This is what he calls the reversal of the overheated medium. For McLuhan, cold media are those such as television that lack an explicit detail and thus have the hypnotic effect of provoking involvement by the viewer. Despite the paradoxical term cold, even fire would count as a cold medium, given its vague and flickering form, so conducive to the mesmerization of humans seated near fireplaces. By contrast, hot media are those such as radio that provide total explicit information. Yet McLuhan's tendency to classify certain types of media as inherently hot or cold is countered by an opposite tendency in his books to treat the heat of a given medium as variable, so that it can increase over time. This is how reversal occurs. While email begins as a convenient labor-saving device that eliminates countless trips to the post office, its numerical increase in instant delivery via smartphone means that we are now constantly at the post office, sending and receiving letters. Notice that reversal, just like the serious artist's retrieval, is a matter of the surface. For nothing in the medium structure of email itself entails reversal. Instead, it is email's interaction with other media, such as smartphones or job duties redefined with the expectation of quick response times, that lead email to reverse from a convenience into a crushing burden that we often wish would disappear into the past. If media are deep and unnoticed, media are unable to change or even to interact with us and with each other without the interface of a surface, McLuhan's despised surface of content. No less than Heidegger, McLuhan fails in his efforts to be a thinker exclusively of the depths and has to become a theorist of how the surface manipulates the depth. And this brings us to the other side of the medium. The medium is interface rather than its hidden background condition. We've seen how McLuhan relies on retrieval and reversal as the engine of human history, and thus becomes a champion of decision and accident rather than deep technological determinism. We even saw that Heidegger is forced into the same predicament despite his contempt for visible beings in the plural as ontic, his term of contempt. But the care for the surface is even more evident in the phenomenologist whom Heidegger tried to turn upside down, his teacher Edmund Husserl. For Husserl, there is no question of an inaccessible world lying beyond all possible access, an idea he regards as nonsense. Although Husserl's philosophical motto was to the things themselves, he did not mean Kant's hidden things in themselves, but only the things themselves lying before us already, intentional objects, or as I call them, sensual objects. If they are lying before us already, you might ask, then what is the use of difficult technical philosophy? But this point is the key to Husserl, for unlike the empiricists who took unified objects to be nothing more than nicknames for a series of different appearances to the mind, so that the supposedly same apple at times T1, T2, and T3 would be only closely related through their family resemblances, Husserl discovered a remarkable world of objects that do not lie deeper than consciousness, but do lie deeper than the details they present to us at any given moment, deeper than the Abschattungen or adumbrations through which they are visible to us. Hence the need for the technical apparatus of philosophy. For as Husserl sees it, it is somewhat difficult to determine the essential features of a specific apple that endure through all the shifting perceptions and experiences we have of it. Along with Heidegger's real apple that withdraws more deeply than any encounter with it, there is Husserl's sensual apple that does not withdraw from the mind, since it is always there, but is still easily confused with its shifting accidental properties. What Husserl calls the eidetic reduction is a method for removing these accidental features of the sensual apple and getting direct intuition into its essence, a project that in my opinion inevitably fails, just as I hold that Meillassoux and Zizek's direct access to reality fails. Although Husserl is often bizarrely linked with Kant, what is missing in Husserl, though present in Heidegger, is the Kantian insight into the permanent rift between the things and themselves in any matter of accessibility. Although media theory might be viewed as having only a peripheral interest for philosophy, communication should be seen as the central problem of modern philosophy. Indeed, I've often written about this theme. For theological reasons, some of the early Arab thinkers held that God was the only possible causal medium. When fire seems to burn cotton, it is actually God who burns cotton. The proximity of fire to cotton only provides the occasion for God himself to burn cotton. Although this is easily ridiculed in the post-Enlightenment West, the topic is still taken seriously when it becomes the mind-body problem in Descartes, who also appeals to God, whether sincerely or not, as the medium of communication between the two different kinds of finite substance, mind and body. And it is taken even more seriously when not God, but the human mind is treated as the universal ether of communication between any two distinct entities, as when David Hume treats causation as customary conjunction or habit of the minds, or when Immanuel Kant treats causation as a structure internal to finite human experience. Yet Kant already oversteps these bounds, as his critics noted very early, when he treats causation not just as an internal structure of phenomenal experience, but as the very link between things in themselves and the appearances, as when he says that there cannot be appearances without things that appear, which cause the appearances. Although obviously a contradiction, it is a fruitful one. Contradiction is often the wage we pay to a reality that exceeds the grasp of our theories. The problem with occasionalist theories, as they're called, is not that they made God the causal medium, which the standard atheism of 21st century Western intellectual life requires us to mock. The philosophical problem with occasionalism is not that God was God, but that God was one specific entity allowed to solve a causal problem that arises as soon as we see that entities are deeper than any possible relation to them. Fire cannot touch cotton directly, not because a particular interpretation of the Quran would forbid it, but because no entity can be given unexplained magic communicative powers that are denied to all other entities. But the same goes for the human mind, as in human Kant, which simply posits the mind as a causal glue while failing to address what happens when object touches object in the absence of any human mind. The gap between non-communicating objects must be bridged in such a way that it can happen anywhere, though with some difficulty, not by appealing to a divine or human king to solve the problem by fiat once and for all. Last paragraph. In one sense, McLuhan joins Heidegger in treating the medium as a background deeper than any possible content, any possible surface manifestation. For McLuhan, the deep structure of the television medium withdraws deeper than the content of any television program, while for Heidegger, the hammer is deeper than any hammer effects until it breaks and comes to our view. But in another sense, McLuhan joins Husserl in seeing the surface of the world as the place where an entity exists in tension with its own shifting accidental properties. Is the medium an inaccessible deep structure, or is it a surface of communication where one thing easily touches another? Which model is correct? The answer is that both must be equally correct in order for the world to function as it does. There is a world in itself, just as Kant says, given that no access to a thing ever gives us the thing in itself, but inevitably translates or distorts it. Yet there is also a sensual world, a world of images and simulacra, that cannot be eliminated in favor of its causal underpinnings. Just as the link between the real medium postal mail and the real medium email is the supposedly superficial realm of surface content, the link between two images is the real medium that I am in each case myself, and that each object is in each case. Two real objects are mediated by the sensual, and two sensual objects are mediated by the real, just as only the opposite poles of magnets can touch without repulsion. The medium is the message, and the message is in turn the medium. Whereas idealism and its bastard child materialism simply eliminate the problem of communication by calling it a pseudo-problem, realism without materialism recognizes communication as the central problem of contemporary philosophy. Thank you.